My husband leaned close to my ear and smiled for the cameras. "Tonight," he whispered softly, "pretend you're not with me. Important people are here." For a second, I thought he was joking. The ballroom was glowing with gold light. Crystal chandeliers hung above hundreds of guests dressed in black tuxedos and shining gowns. A string orchestra played near the stage, while waiters carried silver trays of champagne through the crowd. This was the biggest charity gala in the city, and my husband had just erased me from it. Before I could even speak, he stepped away from me. Then he walked across the room and placed his hand on the back of a tall woman in a red dress. She laughed at something he said. The way she leaned him told me everything I needed to know. They looked like a couple. My chest tightened. 20 years of marriage. 20 years of building his life from the ground up. And now he wanted to pretend I didn't exist. I stood there alone, while people around us began to notice. A few guests looked at me with quiet curiosity. One woman whispered something to the man beside her, while glancing in my direction. Across the room, my husband raised a glass and introduced the woman beside him to a group of wealthy investors. He didn't even look at me. That was the moment something inside me went cold. Because the man pretending he didn't know me tonight had no idea who he had just humiliated. My name is Adriana Val, and this gala was about to become the worst mistake of his life. I had known for weeks that tonight would change everything. 3 weeks earlier, the board had called me. The company's 10th anniversary gala was the moment they had chosen to finally make the disclosure public, the moment I had quietly agreed to after years of silence. I had said yes without hesitation. What I hadn't anticipated was the whisper in my ear at the door. What I hadn't expected was how much it would hurt. If stories about betrayal, secrets, and powerful comebacks are your kind of stories, take a moment to subscribe. Because the truth about this night is far bigger than what my husband thought he could hide. I stayed exactly where I was. For a moment, I couldn't move. The orchestra kept playing, soft violins floating through the air like nothing had happened. Guests laughed. Cameras flashed near the stage. The smell of expensive perfume and champagne filled the ballroom. But inside my chest, something felt heavy. Across the room, my husband looked perfectly comfortable. He stood beside the woman in red as if they had arrived together. I watched him lean closer to her, speaking in that confident voice he used when he wanted to impress powerful people. She touched his arm and laughed again. The sight made my stomach twist. I knew that laugh. It was the kind of laugh women give when they think a man is charming. A few guests began to glance at me. They had seen him arrive with me earlier. Now they were watching him with someone else. I could almost hear the silent questions moving through the crowd. Who was the other woman? Why was his wife standing alone? For a moment, humiliation burned through my chest. I wanted to walk out of that ballroom, but then I remembered his exact words. "Pretend you're not with me. Important people are here." Slowly, I lifted my chin. Fine. If that was the game he wanted to play tonight, I would play it perfectly. Because pretending we were strangers would be very easy. Especially once the truth came out. The woman in the red dress stayed close to him. Everywhere he moved, she followed. I watched them from across the ballroom as they spoke with a group of donors near the stage. He introduced her proudly. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see the way people reacted. Smiles, handshakes, interest, the kind of attention he had been chasing for years. My husband loved powerful rooms like this. He loved being admired. But tonight, he looked different. More confident, more arrogant. The kind of man who believed he had finally reached the top. A waiter passed by with champagne. I took one glass and held it in my hand, even though I didn't drink. Across the room, I saw him lean closer to the woman again. She placed her hand lightly on his chest. A small gesture, but intimate. My fingers tightened around the glass. That was when I realized something important. He wasn't just ignoring me tonight. He was replacing me. The realization stung more than I expected. But strangely, it didn't make me angry. It made me certain. Because my husband believed this was his night. He believed he was walking into a new future. He had no idea the entire evening had been built around a secret he didn't know. A secret connected to the company he was so proud of. And the moment that secret was revealed, this room would never look at him the same way again. I moved toward the balcony doors at the edge of the ballroom. Cool night air drifted inside as guests stepped outside to talk quietly. From there, I could still see him clearly. My husband stood near the stage now. The woman in red stayed close beside him. Someone handed them both glasses of champagne. They looked comfortable, like a perfect pair. For a moment, I closed my eyes. A memory rose up from years ago. A tiny apartment with peeling paint, secondhand furniture, bills stacked on a small kitchen table. Back then, my husband had been a completely different man. He used to thank me for everything, every meal, every long shift I worked, every sacrifice. "I'll make it up to you someday." He used to promise, "I swear I will." I believed him. I believed every word. When his small startup company almost collapsed years later, I did something he never knew about, something that saved his entire career, something that kept his dream alive. I never told him. I didn't want him to feel small, so I stayed quiet and I let him believe he had done it all himself. But tonight, watching him stand beside another woman while pretending I didn't exist, I finally understood something painful. My silence had not protected our marriage. It had only helped build the man who was now ashamed of me. A voice interrupted my thoughts. "Mrs. Vale." I turned. One of the event organizers stood behind me. He wore a black suit and held a small tablet in his hand. His expression was polite but serious. "We'll be starting the announcement soon," he said quietly. "Are you ready?" For a moment, I simply nodded. The announcement. Across the ballroom, my husband laughed loudly at something someone said. The woman in red rested her hand on his arm again. Neither of them noticed me. The board had spent months preparing this moment. The company's 10th anniversary gala was the right stage, large enough, visible enough, and significant enough to mark the beginning of a new chapter. The legal paperwork had been updated. The press release was drafted and waiting. All that had remained was my agreement. And I had given it 3 weeks ago. I glanced toward the stage. The microphone stood ready beneath the bright lights. Soon the host would begin the speech. Soon the guests would learn the identity of the mysterious investor who had quietly saved the company years ago. The investor whose money had prevented bankruptcy. The investor who now held the largest share of the company. For years, a small circle within the board had kept that name secret. Tonight was the first time it would be revealed publicly. My husband believed the announcement was about the company's future. He believed he was about to receive praise. He had no idea the truth was walking toward the stage. I took a slow breath. Across the room, he raised his glass again beside the woman in red. "Pretend you're not with me. Important people are here." Fine. In a few minutes, the entire room would discover exactly who I was, and pretending would no longer be possible. I stayed near the balcony a moment longer. Across the ballroom, my husband moved through the crowd like a man who owned it, confident, untouchable, completely unaware. He had no idea that the story people told about him, the miracle turnaround, the brilliant leader who saved his own company, was missing its most important chapter. Only a handful of people in the world knew the truth. Tonight, everyone would. Watching him pulled me back to the night everything almost ended. His company had been drowning. Bills piling faster than contracts, investors backing away. The bank had already sent warning letters. I still remember the way he looked sitting at our kitchen table. Exhausted, defeated. "I think it's over," he had said quietly. It was the first time I had ever seen him truly afraid. That was when I made a decision he never knew about. A few weeks earlier, my aunt had passed away. She had left me something unexpected. A large inheritance. I hadn't told anyone yet. Not even my husband. The money was enough to save the company. But I knew what it would do to him if he found out his success came from me. Pride mattered to him. So I contacted one of the trusted board members, privately. An anonymous investment. One condition. My name would stay hidden. The board member agreed and brought in 2 colleagues he trusted completely to handle the paperwork. The company survived, and my husband believed he had saved it himself. The deal had been simple. My investment came through a private holding company. A few trusted board members knew exactly who I was, and they kept that secret with careful discretion. The company just recovered. Debts were paid, contracts returned. Within 2 years, it was stronger than it had ever been. My husband became the face of that success. Interviews, business magazines, industry awards. Every time I saw him standing proudly in those photos, I felt two things at once: pride and silence. The truth sat beside him at the dinner table every night. But I kept my word to myself and to the board members who had trusted me, and for many years I believed that story would remain untouched. Until tonight. The orchestra music softened. The evening's formal program was about to begin. Across the room, my husband guided the woman in red toward a table close to the stage. He pulled out her chair. She smiled warmly at him. The stage lights flickered on. A man in a tuxedo stepped up to the microphone. The host. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began warmly, "thank you for joining us tonight." The room slowly quieted. My husband leaned slightly toward the woman in red and whispered something. She smiled again. He still hadn't looked in my direction. The host continued speaking about the charity foundation, the investors, the importance of the evening. Then he reached the part everyone had been waiting for, the special announcement. And suddenly, my heart began beating faster, because I knew exactly what came next. The host's voice carried clearly through the ballroom. "Tonight," he said, "we also celebrate a remarkable story of resilience." A large screen behind the stage lit up. Images of my husband's company appeared, old photos, the early office, the difficult years. Guests nodded with interest. My husband straightened proudly in his chair. The woman in red clapped politely beside him. The host continued. "Several years ago, this company faced a financial crisis that nearly forced it to close its doors. More images appeared, news headlines, articles about the company's sudden recovery. Most people believe that success story began with strong leadership," the host said, "and leadership certainly played a role." My husband smiled confidently. "But what many people do not know," the host continued, "is that the company was saved by a private investor who stepped in at the most critical moment." Whispers began moving through the room. This was new information. Even many business reporters didn't know this part of the story. The host paused dramatically. "For years, that investor asked to remain anonymous. I felt my pulse in my throat." Across the room, my husband leaned forward slightly, curious, interested, still completely unaware. "Tonight," the host said, "for the first time, that investor has agreed to reveal their identity." The ballroom went silent. Hundreds of guests waited, and I slowly began walking toward the stage. Before I tell you what happened next, if you enjoy powerful real-life-style stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because what happened in the next few minutes inside that ballroom changed my husband's life forever. The sound of my heels on the marble floor felt louder than the orchestra. Step, step, step. I walked slowly through the crowd as the host paused on stage. Guests began turning their heads. At first, only a few noticed me moving toward the front of the room. Then more eyes followed. A soft ripple of whispers spread across the ballroom. Some people recognized me as my husband's wife. Others simply wondered why I was walking toward the stage. Across the room, my husband finally looked up. For the first time that night, his eyes met mine. His expression showed confusion. Not anger, not embarrassment. Just confusion. He glanced around the room as if trying to understand why people were suddenly watching me. The woman in red followed his gaze. Her smile faded slightly. I continued walking. The host watched me approach and gave a small, respectful nod. The board had briefed him earlier that evening as part of the carefully prepared program. So did the board members sit at the table near the stage. They had known for years. I reached the steps and walked up beside the microphone. The ballroom had grown so quiet that even the clinking of glasses had stopped. Hundreds of eyes stared at me. Across the room, my husband slowly stood from his chair. His face had gone pale, and for the first time since we arrived tonight, he looked nervous. The host stepped aside and handed me the microphone. The metal felt cool in my hand. For a moment, I simply looked out at the crowd. Rows of powerful people, investors, business leaders, politicians, the same kind of people my husband had spent years trying to impress. Tonight, they were all watching me. I took a slow breath. "My name is Unveiling," I said calmly. A wave of murmurs moved through the room. Most people already knew that name, but they knew it only as my husband's wife, nothing more. Across the ballroom, my husband remained standing. His eyes were fixed on me. The woman in red looked between us, clearly confused. I continued speaking. "Many years ago," I said, "this company faced a moment when it might not survive. A few board members nodded quietly, the ones who had carried this secret alongside me. They remembered that time well. The bank was preparing to close its credit lines, I continued. Employees feared they would lose their jobs. Investors had already begun pulling away. My husband swallowed slowly. He remembered that moment too. Everyone in the room was listening now. But someone stepped in, I said. Someone who believed the company still had a future. A long silence filled the ballroom, then I finished the sentence. That person was me. The room erupted into shocked whispers, and across the ballroom, my husband looked like the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. The whispers grew louder. Some guests leaned toward each other, speaking quickly. Others stared at me with open shock. I could see the moment the truth began spreading through the room. Across the ballroom, my husband slowly sat down again, but his eyes never left me. He looked like a man trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly made no sense. The woman in the red dress leaned toward him. "Is she serious?" she asked quietly. I couldn't hear her words, but I could read the confusion on her face. I continued speaking into the microphone. At the time, the company needed a large emergency investment to survive. A few reporters near the back began raising their phones, recording, documenting. The story was already becoming bigger than the gala. I made that investment privately, I explained. I asked a small number of board members to keep my identity confidential. Those same board members nodded again. One of them even stood slightly and raised his glass toward me in silent respect. The investment allowed the company to recover, I said. Over time, that investment also became the company's largest ownership share. That sentence changed the mood of the entire room. Now the whispers weren't just surprised, they were calculating. Because everyone here understood what that meant. Control, power, decision-making authority. Across the ballroom, my husband looked completely frozen. The man who had asked me to pretend we weren't together was suddenly realizing the truth. He had just humiliated the person who controlled his entire company. The host stepped back beside me as the room slowly quieted again. Even the orchestra had stopped playing. People were listening carefully now. Business leaders understood exactly what this situation meant. I continued speaking calmly. For many years I stayed silent, I said. I wanted the company's leadership to succeed on its own. My eyes moved toward my husband. He looked like a man standing in the middle of a storm he didn't understand. But silence, kept too long, can start to protect the wrong things. The board members nodded again. Several guests clapped politely, but the tension in the room was still growing, because everyone could see the uncomfortable reality forming. My husband had built his public reputation on the idea that he saved the company himself. Now the story was changing, and it was changing in front of the entire city's business community. I turned back toward the audience. Tonight, I continued, the board asked if I would finally allow my identity as the original investor to be revealed. The company's 10th anniversary felt like the right moment for the truth. More cameras lifted. The moment was becoming historic. So I agreed, I said. I paused briefly. Then I added one final sentence, and I also agreed to make a few important decisions about the company's future. Across the ballroom, my husband slowly stood again. This time, he looked terrified. The room held its breath. My husband stepped away from his table and began walking toward the stage. His movements were stiff, uncertain, like someone walking into a situation he couldn't control. The woman in red remained behind, watching with wide eyes. He reached the front row and stopped. "Adriana," he said quietly. The microphone carried his voice through the room. It was the first time he had spoken my name that evening. I looked down at him from the stage. For years, I had watched him grow into the powerful man everyone admired. Tonight, he looked smaller, confused. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked. His voice sounded almost desperate. I answered honestly, "Because I didn't want your success to feel like it belonged to me." The silence in the room deepened. "But success also reveals character," I added gently. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Everyone remembered the moment earlier tonight. The moment he had publicly dismissed his own wife. My husband ran a hand through his hair. "This doesn't change anything," he said quickly. "We built that company together." His words sounded confident. But the room didn't react the way he expected. Because everyone here understood corporate power. And legally, ownership mattered more than pride. I glanced toward the board members. They were already standing, and one of them stepped forward to join me at the microphone. The real announcement was about to begin. The board member stepped beside me at the microphone. His name was Daniel Ward. He was one of the 3 board members who had known the truth from the beginning, one of the trusted few I had approached in secret all those years ago when I made my offer. He adjusted the microphone slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "many of you know me as a member of the board." Several guests nodded. Daniel continued. "Years ago, when the company was facing bankruptcy, Mrs. Vale stepped forward with the investment that saved every job in that building." A few employees sitting near the back began clapping softly. The sound grew louder. Respect moved through the room. Across the floor, my husband looked like he had just been struck. He tried to speak again. "This is unnecessary," he said. His voice sounded strained. Daniel glanced down at him briefly. "I'm afraid it is necessary," he replied. Then he turned back to the audience. "Because ownership of that investment means something very important." A large document appeared on the screen behind the stage. Corporate records, share distribution, legal signatures. The numbers were clear. My name sat at the top. Majority shareholder. Gas spread through the ballroom. That meant control. Real control. My husband stared at the screen like a man seeing a ghost. The company he believed he commanded had belonged to me for years. The atmosphere in the ballroom changed instantly. What had started as a charity gala was now turning into something far bigger. Guests leaned forward in their seats, phones were recording, people whispered quietly to each other. Daniel continued speaking. "Because Mrs. Vale holds the largest ownership share in the company, she has the authority to make certain executive decisions." My husband shook his head slowly. "This is ridiculous," he said. "We never discussed any of this." His voice sounded louder now. Defensive. Daniel remained calm. The investment agreement was legally filed with the board at the time it was made. The screen behind us displayed the signed documents. My signature, board approval, legal verification, everything had been carefully recorded years earlier. My husband stared at the documents. His confidence was fading quickly. Around the room, several investors were now whispering with interest. Power shifts fascinated people in rooms like this, especially when they happen publicly. Daniel stepped back slightly and looked toward me. "Mrs. Vale," he said respectfully, "the decision now rests with you." Hundreds of eyes turned back to me. My husband's face had lost all color. For the first time that night, the powerful CEO everyone admired looked completely powerless, and the room was waiting to hear what I would do next. I held the microphone gently. The room was silent again. "My intention was never to embarrass anyone tonight," I said calmly. A few people shifted in their chairs. Everyone knew exactly who I meant. "But I have come to understand that protecting someone's pride is not the same as protecting what is right." The memory of his whisper returned clearly. "Pretend you're not with me. Important people are here." The humiliation had lasted only seconds, but it had revealed something deeper, something painful. I looked out across the room again. Many people here had watched that moment earlier. Now they understood its meaning. "Respect matters in every relationship," I said quietly. "Business and personal." No one spoke. No one interrupted. "My goal tonight is simple," I continued. "I want the company to continue growing with leadership that values integrity." The word hung in the air. Integrity. Across the ballroom, my husband swallowed hard. He knew what was coming. Daniel stepped forward again beside me. "Mrs. Vale has made a decision regarding the leadership of the company," he announced. And suddenly the tension in the room became almost unbearable. My husband stepped closer to the stage. "Adriana," he said urgently. His voice had changed now. Gone was the confidence from earlier. Gone was the arrogance. Now he sounded desperate. "Let's talk about this privately," he added. The entire ballroom heard every word. I looked down at him calmly. "For 20 years we spoke privately," I said. A few guests exchanged quiet looks. "You made your decision publicly tonight." The sentence landed like a stone in the room. My husband opened his mouth to argue again, but no words came out. The woman in the red dress still sat at the table near the stage. Her expression had shifted from confidence to embarrassment. She was suddenly very interested in the tablecloth. Daniel cleared his throat softly. "Mrs. Vale," he said. He was reminding me that the room was waiting. I nodded once. Then I turned back toward the microphone. "For the good of the company," I said slowly, "I have decided to make a leadership change." Gasps moved through the audience. Corporate power shifts were always dramatic, but rarely this public, rarely this personal. Across the room, my husband looked like a man watching his entire future collapse. And the final words hadn't even been spoken yet. I took a slow breath. Then I finished the sentence. "As majority shareholder, I am removing my husband from the position of Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately." The room exploded with whispers. Some guests gasped. Others stared openly at my husband. He looked frozen, completely stunned. "No," he said quietly. His voice barely carried through the microphone. "You can't do that." Daniel stepped forward again. "The board supports this decision," he said firmly. Several board members stood up behind their table. One by one, their silence made the message clear. My husband looked around the room desperately, searching for someone to defend him, but the investors were watching carefully, studying the shift in power. The reporters were already typing on their phones. This moment would be everywhere by morning. He turned back to me, his voice cracked. "You're destroying everything we built." I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I'm protecting it." The orchestra remained silent. No one moved. The entire ballroom was witnessing the fall of a man who had believed he owned the night. The silence after the announcement felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. Hundreds of people were staring at my husband, the same people who had admired him only minutes earlier. Now their expressions had changed. Some looked shocked, some looked uncomfortable. A few looked curious, the way people do when they realize they are watching history happen. My husband stood frozen near the stage. "You can't do this," he said again. But his voice was weaker now. The confidence he had walked into the ballroom with had completely disappeared. Daniel stepped forward calmly. "The board agreement gives Mrs. Vale the authority to appoint or remove executive leadership," he explained. One of the reporters near the back spoke quietly into her phone. The story was already spreading. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing on my chest. This wasn't revenge. It was something deeper. For years I had protected him, protected the company, protected the life we built. But tonight had revealed something I could no longer ignore. The man standing below the stage had stopped respecting the people who helped him rise. And leadership without respect always collapses eventually. My husband ran his hands through his hair. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. The room waited. I met his eyes one last time. "Now," I said gently, "the company begins its next chapter." Daniel spoke again. "Effective immediately, Mrs. Vale will assume interim leadership of the company, while the board conducts a full review of executive operations." The sentence felt calm, professional, but its meaning was enormous. The company my husband had run for years was now under my authority. A few investors began clapping slowly, then more joined. The applause wasn't loud or celebratory, it was respectful, acknowledging the shift that had just taken place. My husband looked around the room as if searching for someone to stop it. But no one did. In rooms like this, power always followed ownership, and ownership had already been decided years ago. The woman in the red dress quietly stood from her chair. She avoided looking at either of us as she moved toward the exit. Her earlier confidence had completely vanished. My husband watched her leave. For a brief moment, the realization hit him all at once. The future he had imagined tonight was disappearing. The room grew quiet again as the applause faded. Daniel turned to me. "Would you like to say anything else?" I looked out at the crowd, at the reporters, at the investors. Then I looked down at my husband one more time. "Yes," I said. "There's one final thing." I held the microphone gently. "For many years," I said slowly, "I believed loyalty meant staying quiet." The ballroom listened carefully. I believed supporting someone meant protecting their pride. A few guests nodded. They understood the meaning behind those words. But tonight reminded me that respect must exist on both sides. The memory of his whisper echoed again. "Pretend you're not with me. Important people are here." I looked directly at him. "When someone asks you to disappear," I continued calmly, "sometimes the most honest thing you can do is finally be seen." The sentence moved through the room like a quiet wave. My husband lowered his head. For the first time in 20 years, he had no control over the story unfolding around him. Daniel gently placed a folder on the podium beside me. Inside were the official documents confirming the leadership change. Legal. Final. Signed years ago when I made the investment. I closed the folder without opening it. I never wanted tonight to feel like a punishment, I said, but truth has a way of revealing itself. The reporters continued, recording every word. This moment would follow him for years, but strangely, I didn't feel anger. Only clarity. Because sometimes the most painful endings simply reveal the truth that was already there. The formal program ended quietly. Guests slowly began standing and speaking to one another. The orchestra started playing again, though the music felt softer now. My husband remained near the stage. He looked older than he had when the night began. The confidence he once carried had drained away. When most of the crowd began drifting toward the exits, he finally approached me. "Adriana," he said quietly. There was no arrogance in his voice now, only regret. "I didn't know," he said. I nodded slightly. "I know." For a moment we stood there in silence. 20 years of memories passed between us without words. "You could have told me," he added. "I could have," I agreed. "But would it have changed tonight?" He didn't answer, because we both knew the truth. The disrespect earlier hadn't come from ignorance. It had come from the man he had become. The woman in the red dress was long gone now. The ballroom that once felt glamorous now looked strangely empty. My husband glanced around the room one last time. The reporters were still nearby. The investors were already discussing the future of the company. Everything had changed. "I'm sorry," he said finally. His voice was quiet, sincere. But some apologies arrived too late. I stepped down from the stage and walked toward the exit. The marble floor echoed softly under my heels. Several board members approached me, speaking about meetings and plans for the next week, the future of the company, the next steps. But for a moment, I simply focused on the quiet feeling inside my chest, peace. Behind me, the ballroom continued buzzing with conversations. The story of tonight would spread quickly. By morning, the entire business community would know what happened here. The CEO who lost his position, the secret investor who revealed herself, the wife who refused to disappear. Outside, the cool night air felt refreshing. City lights stretched across the streets like stars. For years, I had lived quietly in the shadow of someone else's ambition. Tonight had changed that, not because I wanted power, but because I had finally stopped hiding the truth. Behind me, the ballroom doors opened again. My husband stepped outside. He looked at me across the distance. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I turned and continued walking toward the waiting car. Some endings feel like collapse. Others feel like freedom. Tonight was both. And as the city lights reflected across the dark windows, I realized something simple. The man who once asked me to pretend I didn't exist would never be able to forget me again. If you stayed with me until the end of this story, thank you. And if you enjoy stories where the truth finally comes out and people get exactly what they deserve, make sure you subscribe. I share new powerful stories like this every week. I'm curious about what you think. If someone asked you to pretend you didn't exist in a room full of people, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. I read every comment,